I'm Diane Lewis, Chief Programming Officer and Executive Vice President of the Paley Center for Media. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to an extremely relevant PaleyImpact program, The Beauty That Remains, the Legacy of Anne Frank. Tonight, we are going to have a special conversation to commemorate the anniversary of one of the most read and inspiring books of the 20th and I would say so far into the 21st century, The Diary of Anne Frank. In the 75 years since its publication, the story of human resilience and unbreakable spirit during the Holocaust has inspired numerous television shows, films, documentaries, theater productions, and digital content. In our program, our distinguished panel will discuss how this story has been retold in numerous formats and different mediums to generations after generations. The event is part of a series that seeks to shine a light on how media, in all its form, can educate, inform, and make an impact on the persistent and still growing crisis of anti-Semitism. The programs in this series would not be possible without the generous support of Shari Redstone and Aryeh and Alana Burkhoff. We are also grateful for the additional support that has been provided by the David Berg Foundation. Thank you to all of them. Never before has Paley's mission been more vital, as media has become the undisputed connector to a nation in unprecedented times. Paley is uniquely positioned to meet this moment with impactful conversations led by influential figures, such as those we're truly honored to have with us today. You are about to hear from some of the most prolific storytellers, actresses, creators, educators, and witnesses about why the story of Anne Frank inspires them and how the legacy of Anne Frank remains not only relevant but essential to today's audience in an effort to combat anti-Semitism. We are so pleased to welcome actress Melissa Gilbert, director and producer Lynn Novick, show creator Tony Phelan, and CEO of the Anne Frank Center USA, Sharon R. Douglas. We are also honored to have Holocaust survivor and a former neighbor of Anne Frank's, Pieter Kohnstam, joining us by Zoom. The conversation will be moderated by Ruth Franklin. Ruth is a book critic whose literary criticism and essays have been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and Harper's. She is also an award-winning author whose works include 1,000 Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, and is currently working on a book about Anne Frank for the Yale University Press Jewish Lives biography series. Please join me in welcoming Ruth Franklin.
Thank you so much, Diane, for that introduction. Thanks so much to everyone from the Paley Center for having us here tonight to celebrate Anne Frank's legacy. So I'm going to introduce our panel. First, Melissa Gilbert, who we just saw in the 1980 TV movie version of The Diary of Anne Frank, playing Anne, of course. She's the producer of the recent film Guest Artist, written by and starring Jeff Daniels. She also, of course, starred for many years as a child and teenager in Little House on the Prairie. And she's appeared in more than 50 television movies and feature films, including The Miracle Worker and many others. Lynn Novick is a co-director and producer of The U.S. and the Holocaust, which we saw a brief clip of also just now, a documentary produced with Ken Burns and Sarah Botstein for PBS that aired in September, I believe. She's been making documentary films about American life and culture, history, politics, sports, art, literature, just about everything else for more than 30 years, with 19 Emmy nominations, and she's won Emmy, Peabody, and Alfred I. DuPont Columbia Awards. I'm sure many of you are interested in what she's working on next. She's working on a project about the history of crime and punishment in America that's scheduled for 2026, as well as a series, again, with Ken Burns and Sarah Botstein about LBJ's presidency. Tony Phelan, along with his wife, Joan Rader, was the part of the writing team for Grey's Anatomy, and a co-runner of the show alongside Shonda Rhimes for many seasons, for which they earned, again, multiple awards. They've also developed and run the shows Council of Dads, Doubt, and a new series called Fire Country. Tony is now in post-production on a drama series for the Disney Channel, Disney Plus, called A Small Light, which focuses on the story of Miep Gies, one of the office workers who helped to hide and protect the Franks while they were in hiding. It focuses on her story and Otto Frank. Next we have Sharon Douglas. Sharon R. Douglas is a board secretary and chief executive officer of the Anne Frank Center USA. She's a philanthropist and business advisor, and among her many distinctions, she was a member of the delegation to the United Nations for the Anne Frank Declaration of Peace and the New Millennium. On Anne's 90th birthday, which was June 12th, 2019, she planted a sapling from the famous Anne Frank chestnut tree on the grounds of the United Nations. And in 2016, she won the Spirit of Anne Frank Distinguished Advocates Award. And finally, joining us on Zoom, we have Pieter Kohnstam. Pieter was born in Amsterdam in 1936 and was a neighbor of Anne Frank's. She actually served as his babysitter at one point. But after the Nazi regulations tightened in the Netherlands, instead of going into hiding, Pieter's parents made the choice to flee, and they spent a year on the run through Belgium, France, and Spain before finally emigrating to Argentina. Pieter came to the US in 1963 and has lived here ever since. So I welcome you all. Please come to the stage. Good. So I want to begin by asking each of you, people often have stories to tell about their first encounter with Anne Frank. Usually the first reading of their diary, sometimes the first time they may have seen the Broadway play or the movie. So I'll start with you, Melissa. Can you tell us, what was your first encounter with the work of Anne Frank? Do you remember the first time you read the diary? And what was that like?
I remember it clearly. It was a school assignment. Mm-hmm. And I remember because it was one of the two books that my mother was really excited that I would read. The first being Little House on the Prairie, which I read years before the show. And the same with Anne Frank's diary. My mother had a real connection to it, having grown up as here in the States, but also as a Jewish girl, and having lived through the war from her perspective, she felt a real kinship and connection with Anne Frank to a certain extent. And they would have been sort of contemporaries. My mother's now going on 87, so not too far apart in age. And it meant the world to her that I was reading the book, so I took on the mantle of being very thorough and a very good student as I read it, because I knew my mother was expecting me to really absorb it. And it certainly didn't, it wasn't difficult to be absorbed by and inspired by and moved by, even as a young girl.
Did you feel a personal connection to Anne's story right away, or did that come later when you worked on the movie?
Oh no, I felt it immediately because it was the story of someone who was not dissimilar from me. It could have been me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I always knew that.
Yeah.
It could have been me.
Lynn, what about you? Do you remember your first encounter with the diary?
Yes, absolutely, I do. And I'm pretty sure I read it on my own. It wasn't a school assignment, and I was around 12 or 13. Mm-hmm. I was a big reader. I did read a lot. I read Little House on the Prairie and all the other Laura Ingalls Wilder books too. And I was curious about it. I didn't really know what to expect, and I do remember vividly just being completely immersed in this world and in the characters. I mean, I knew they were real people, but the way she describes people and her use of language, and even though it was in a translation, it was very vivid. It felt very real. And, my most salient memory, in addition to just grasping the realities that she's describing, and, even the conflicts with her parents and the tensions within the people that are there and everything. At the end, just, not really being able to fully grasp what happened somehow as a child, myself. And just in that magical thinking, just having sort of fallen in love with her as a person and feeling like I know her, to have to face the fact that she doesn't survive the war. Even though it's not part of the story that's in the book, I remember going to the back and kind of wanting to find some way that it didn't end the way it ended.
Yeah,
And just
right.
being completely devastated.
Yeah,
at that
there's just
age.
this brief
How
author's
could this
note.
happen?
Yeah. This epilogue that doesn't tell us.
Anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. But being shocked, it was a very profound moment of recognizing, having read this whole book as a child and having to understand through that replicate that by millions of people. That feeling never left me. Yeah.
So you immediately, you saw her as a kind of a representative of the 6 million sort of instinctively.
Maybe. I mean,
Maybe not in those
I
words,
don't think I would have put
perhaps.
those words. It was just more, wait, this can't be right. It couldn't have, it's hard to explain as a 12-year-old.
I think it gave context to us.
Yeah.
It enabled us to really relate to this huge number of all of this stuff that we were hearing about and had read about and were learning about, that there was actually someone who was our contemporary, who was a young girl at the time that we were reading the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yes, exactly. And she was so real that it just wasn't possible that she was killed.
Yeah. Tony, what about you? What are your first memories?
Well, I think that's one of the things that makes the diary such an amazing piece of literature, is that each time you read it, you bring whatever you're going through to it. So I remember, because we're working on the show, I read it again within the past, several times within the past couple of years, and each time I found myself going, maybe this time it's going to end differently.
Exactly.
Maybe this time it's going to. And I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and there was, at my public high school, there was a class that you took on the Holocaust, and one of the assignments at the end of the class was find a survivor, get their testimony, and bring it into the class, because these were the grandparents and parents of all of my friends. And the fact that now Anne Frank is not being taught in the same way in the schools that it was, and also that generation of people is disappearing. I'll just share one thing that is related, but 6 years ago when we took our children to the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, we were there reading all the plaques and everything, and I was reading the plaque about Miep and what she had done and the fact that she was Otto's secretary, and I turn and I look and I see my 22-year-old son, who is brilliant, but could not find his way back to the hotel if his life depended on it. And I was like, Miep was his age and was tasked with this amazing responsibility. And that was really one of those kind of seminal moments where you're like, this is a story that we can bring ideally to a whole new generation of young people and make it relatable to them.
Great. And Sharon, what about you? I know you do feel a deep personal connection to the
Yes.
legacy of Anne Frank.
I do. And the Anne Frank diary is the depiction of the 6 million Jews that died in the form of one girl's association and living through the fear and horror of it. But my legacy is very different. My family, my grandfather came from Vitebsk, the town of Chagall also, and his brother went to London and had 7 children. One of those children had the opportunity, Isidore and B. Klug, to go to the Anne Frank house in the late 50s, early 60s, and were very moved by it. Came back, my cousin B wrote a poem called The Ballad of Anne Frank, and my cousin Sid went to a real estate meeting and said they had had a wonderful time, and his wife wrote a poem, and someone sitting at the table said, my father-in-law is Otto Frank. It was Eva Schloss's husband, Svi. And I've known Eva for 30, 40 years, and I knew Svi also, a wonderful man. He took the ballad of Anne Frank to Otto, and B invited Otto to their house for a Sabbath dinner in Bournemouth, and they talked about creating the Anne Frank Center in the UK, the Anne Frank Educational Trust. Otto's mission throughout all of his life was to educate people to understand what happened in the past should not happen in the future, and to learn from what happened in the past. And so the Anne Frank Center was funded, and my cousin Bee was the president. She was given an OBE. She donated the first set of Holocaust books to Windsor Castle. And I read the diary, but it came to life for me at the moment when my cousins did this. And it came alive for me. I was able to attend functions at 10 Downing Street, 11 Downing Street, meet Geese's birthday at Parliament. And so my legacy is rich, and my understanding of who Anne Frank is just amazing. And so she lives for me and my family and my children, and I hope I'll be able to pass it on to them.
And Sharon, as you see it, what does Anne's story represent in today's world? How would you sum up your perspective on that?
It's very interesting. I have a few notes. Anne is a power of one. 75 years later, in 70 languages, the diary has inspired young people around the world. Decades after she's been gone, she's still a power of pen to paper, a guiding influence that can help console and assures us that we have a friend, and that paper is, quote, more patient than people. These young readers of decades ago go on to be congresspersons. I had the opportunity to watch C-SPAN, and there is a Congresswoman, Mary Jo Kilroy from Ohio, who asked the House to pass Resolution 1074 to declare Meep Geese a woman of valor and courage for saving the diary. And so I called her up, and we honored her at a gala. And I said, Mary Jo, why? And she said, because I was a young girl of 13. I lived in Ohio. I had no prospects. But when I read the Anne Frank diary, I wanted to be what Anne Frank couldn't be. Poet laureates, Natasha Trethewey. We honored her a couple of years ago, and when I called her at Northwestern, I said, why? She said, well, I was reading the Anne Frank diary, and there was a big tragedy in my home. And I was able to go through this family tragedy because of the diary. And that was my inspiration to become a poet. Mandela. Nelson Mandela read Anne Frank's diary on Robben Island. And when it became torn and tattered, they went into a little cave that actually had snakes in it, and they rewrote it on toilet paper. True story.
Oh.
It's amazing. We have TikTokers, Montana Tucker. We have actors and actresses who play Anne Frank. I've spoken to Millie Perkins, who played the first Anne Frank in the film, all thrilled and delighted to be part of it. But why and how? Otto Frank's mission is education. You learn from the past so as not to repeat it. Our educational programs go all over the United States. In any school that calls us to help young students see the dangers of anti-Semitism, hatred, and intolerance through our exhibits and peer-to-peer training, because the impact of one student teaching another student makes them ambassadors for Anne Frank.
That's amazing. I mean, from Nelson Mandela to TikTok, that was just the entire right?
TikTok. Right.
Pieter Kohnstam, in a way, you lived Anne Frank's story. I want to invite you to share a memory of her and of your life in Amsterdam, and also maybe talk a little bit about what you thought when her diary was published.
All right. If you have a year's time, I'll tell you. First of all, I want to thank the Paley organization. I've discussed it with Kim on the background history that I remember firsthand from Paley and Mr. Murrow reporting from London
Oh, wow.
in 1938, 1941, 42.
Wow.
That having been said, I want to thank my mentor, Sharon, who is a colleague, a member, like I am, of the board of directors of Anne Frank. I'm also intimately involved with being a promoter. In the Old Testament, I would be called a schlepping messenger. However, Anne Frank was a very unique girl who radiated her playful personality with intellect, knowledge, phenomenal creativity, and interest in many different things. As she was in our home, which was only 2 apartments away. And during the good days, my grandmother, it was my babysitter. I was 6 years younger than, 7 years younger than Anna was. And her mother was a little bit too proper in keeping their apartment, which was larger than ours, in order. So in our apartment, she could leave the papers and writings wherever, and she would act out fables and fantasies. She was extremely interested in fashion, high-heeled shoes, especially red ones, read tremendously, and I was the little boy, like a baby, to her, I guess, who had to be the audience. And she loved my grandmother's baking. Actually, that was another incentive. She was an impressive girl. And I think that in my 86 years, she has by far, at that age, surpassed many children of her age in her vision, in her writings, and phenomenal optimism. In concentration camp, not to talk about the raids and the bombings in Amsterdam from 1939 through 1942, when we both, our families, had to flee, who became very good friends and played bridge during curfew hours, while I was munching some cookies on the floor someplace. My grandmother, I quote her saying, "We haven't heard anything about this girl yet, but wait." And as she was getting ill, because she wasn't gassed in concentration camp, she died of an illness. She was still looking at those glorious sunny days where people at the end of the day and on the bottom of your soul would be better and kinder than what we had seen. And I've been paraphrasing her quotation. Since I was able or invited to join the Anne Frank organization, and because of my wife, who is formerly a psychiatric mental health social worker, etc., I learned a lot of things about me. How do I rationalize having Anne on my shoulder right now, smiling? We were invited by Otto at the utmost secrecy when he did, to hide with him in the annex. And after some emotional meetings in our apartment, which was a few steps away, it was decided for various reasons that that was not going to happen. The Kohnstams and the Franks had very similar upbringings. They in Frankfurt, my parents in Nuremberg and Fürth. But industrialized merchants, Otto was also in the banking business. So who would have expected that this girl, as Sharon mentioned, would become the second to the Bible, if I understand it correctly, published authorette, as I call it. And people have not tired in taking this little girl and expanding into all kind of presentations.
Good. Well, I'd like to connect from there. You were talking about the challenges of translating Anne's story into new media. And yeah, I want to raise with each of you the question of how do we balance the need for historical accuracy with the demands of entertainment media in all of its different forms. Melissa, I'm curious about how you approached playing the role of Anne Frank. What kind of preparation did you do? Did it come easily? Was it particularly challenging?
The year before we did the Diary of Anne Frank, we had done The Miracle Worker, and that was the first major role I had after playing Laura Ingalls Wilder for a couple of seasons. And my mother had taken me to meet with a manager who asked me, who sat me down, and one of the first things he said was, if you could play any fantasy roles, anybody you ever wanted to play in the whole world, who would you want to play? Whose story do you want to tell? And I said, well, Helen Keller would be great. I said Anne Frank would be great. Joan of Arc would be great. I listed, yeah, basically, just the most inspirational. But I mean, I was a kid. I think at that time I was about 11, and they listened. Boy, did they listen! And so when they established our company, the first movie was The Miracle Worker, and then a year later we did The Diary of Anne Frank. And when we did The Miracle Worker, before we shot the movie, we actually did it as a play for 6 weeks at the then doesn't exist anymore, Royal Poinciana Playhouse in Florida. And I had never done a play before, so that was my introduction to theater as well. We did not have time, because of our extraordinary international cast of actors on The Diary of Anne Frank, we didn't have time to gather everyone together to do another run as a play, which we would have preferred to do. So in order to get that experience and share that experience with the crew, which was also the crew from Little House on the Prairie, I stole them for all my own productions because I would shoot our movies on hiatus and everybody would just move over from Michael's set to my set. My set, like I was a boss of any kind at 14. Sort of was, though. We decided to go into a really lengthy rehearsal process, which is kind of unusual for television. Now, highly unusual. Back then, not so terribly unusual, but we did. We got a big rehearsal space at 20th Century Fox Studios where we shot the movie, and we taped everything and got all our props and stuff, and we rehearsed it like a play, and then we did it as a play for the crew. And oftentimes, I find that a lot of the crew will come to work and not really, I mean, they're the department heads who are very engaged in what we're doing because they have to know what's coming, but a lot of the crew don't get into the minutia of the story that we're doing. And we all felt that it was really important that everyone have a very strong emotional connection to what we were doing with this story. And our production designer intentionally built a set that was very small, almost, the walls really didn't come off, except it was very fourth wall, very much like filming a play, very claustrophobic. And so when we performed it for the crew, mind you, this was our Little House crew who had been, with, since before Michael Landon. They were together on High Chaparral, then Bonanza, then Little House on the Prairie. So they've been together lot of old, tobacco chewing, beer drinking, tough guys. And we staged our little production for them. And I remember seeing Ronnie Husho, our key grip, who was just this sort of big, boisterous, loud, he belched really loud, which I thought was fantastic because I was a kid. I would think it was fantastic now also. I remember when we finished, looking out at the whole crew sitting there in just this little rehearsal hall and keying into Ronnie Husho, and he was just weeping. And I remember looking at him and thinking, okay, well, now we're really onto something special. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the process was going through that little rehearsal process step by step and working with, Max Schell, who you saw, and Joan Plowright, and James Coco, and Doris Roberts, and Boris Segal, our extraordinary director, and Scott Jacoby, who played Pieter, and developing the character that way, but then having the opportunity to do it as a play for the crew like that, it really set us up and it bonded us together as a cast so that by the time we got into actually filming it, we knew obviously we knew all our lines, we knew what we were doing, we knew what we were going, so it was a very smooth but very emotional process. It was one of the most silent sets I've ever been on. I was telling everyone when we were in a green room before that it was a very somber, I hadn't seen that crew, they're a very boisterous group of mostly men, but they were a very, very somber telling the story. It was like we all knew we were saying something and telling the story not only of something important that had happened, but something we wanted to prevent from ever happening again, and that we now had the mantle of carrying that legacy forward. And I remember thinking the entire time that this was a we job, not a me job.
Lynn, I'm interested. Obviously, your process is totally different as a documentary filmmaker. You, in the U.S. and the Holocaust, you frame a lot of the episodes around Anne Frank's story. I'm curious about why you made that choice, what went into that decision.
Yeah, so I'm sort of speaking for myself, but also for my collaborators, which is Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, and Jeff Ward, who wrote our script, that we decided to take on a series telling the story of the United States and the Holocaust, which was to sort of ask some pretty central questions that I think none of us really fully knew the answers to, which was, what did Americans know about the persecution of the Jews and ultimately what came to be known as the Holocaust? How did they know it? At the high levels of government and down to ordinary people and within the Jewish community, and sort of, what kind of knowledge was available, and how did the American nation respond? And for a lot of, and why did we fail to do more? So those are the questions. And so this is the story we wanted to tell. And, we interviewed a number of survivors. We talked to a lot of historians, sort of asking these kind of questions. And in thinking about, well, how do we sort of open the door to our audience so that when you sit down to watch TV and you see episode 1, you understand what this is going to be about. It's not, and I hate to say this, and please do not take it the wrong way, but not another movie about the Holocaust. There have been many brilliant, landmark, seminal works done on that topic. We were not expecting to just tell the story of the Holocaust again, but through this American lens, we wanted really to explain to an audience, this is a story that is about us. And when we discovered that Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank, had tried to come to the United States multiple times in the 30s and had not succeeded, and there was paperwork documenting letters back and forth, and we knew he had applied for visas for the family and that his wife had family members that were here. That was, really interesting. And then we began to think, well, what if we start the film with this idea that Anne Frank, who everyone in America has heard of, and who many of us probably think is a story about something that happened over there, this is about us too. And so that was really an idea to try. And we tried a few different options, but to make this prologue that we show, the film opens with the story of Otto Frank deciding to leave Frankfurt after Hitler comes to power and go to Amsterdam, where he thinks they'll be safe. And that later on they would try to come to America, and the Americans didn't want to let them in. And then we sort of thread that story through the rest of the film. And, and just sitting here tonight and thinking about this, it's hard to really put words around the humility with which we even presume to include this story in our film, and the care with which we chose the excerpts from the diary that we asked for permission to include, and then who would read the voice. And, you know, there's a huge responsibility to take this with great care and position it in this larger narrative so that our American and international audiences could appreciate that this is a way to connect all these threads. Yeah, so.
Tony, I'm interested in how you're approaching the new series that you're doing. It's not documentary, but I think it sounds like it's not entirely fiction either, right? You were talking about the great amount of research that you've been doing for it.
We
How
did
do
about
you define
6
that?
years worth of research. We hired a Dutch researcher who combed through the archives in Amsterdam, and we translated multiple interviews that Miep and Jan had done for Dutch television. We were really looking to kind of unearth who these people were, the decision that they made, and to tell the story of Anne Frank from outside of the annex. That while we're familiar with Anne's perspective, to have another perspective on the story and to explore characters like Anne's mother and Dr. Pfeffer, who get sort of rough. They're treated pretty roughly in the diary because Anne was a teenage girl. But to try and have that other perspective. And then I have to say, I just turned in the final episode, the director's cut of the final episode of our show, which is 8 episodes long. So you really get to spend time with these characters. And it's the episode that takes place after Miep has gone to Gestapo headquarters and tried to bribe the Germans to let everybody go after they've been arrested. It tells that story from that moment to the moment when she presents Otto with a diary, once they realize that he's the only person who's coming back from the camps. And from the perspective of the diary, the diary stops before Anne and everybody gets arrested. So it really does provide you with the context of them all not coming back. And the fact that Miep, because she knew that the diary was important to Anne, when they went upstairs to the annex after the arrest, determined to save everything before the Germans came and carted all the furniture away, and she happened to see all these papers on the ground and realized what it was, and she picked up those papers for Anne because she knew that this was Anne's diary and she was saving it for her, for when she came back. She never read it. She put it in a drawer in the office and just waited for the moment when Anne was going to come back. So to tell that story, as well as to put the story of the people in the annex in the larger context of the Dutch resistance and what was happening in Amsterdam at the time, that was really what we set out to do, to kind of take the story that many of us are very familiar with and just turn it a little bit and tell that story from a different perspective.
That story obviously is so powerful and important, but I'm wondering, what was it that made you decide to tell that story now?
Events of the past couple of years, I think. Also because my family is from Austria, and I was really drawn to this idea that Otto and his family were immigrants, and Miep was an immigrant, and they came together in this very kind of modern city. And that's, I think, one of the things that pulled those two people together, was that they shared language and culture and were of different classes. She was of a lower class and he was pretty cultured, but that these two people found each other. And after the war, Otto lived with Miep and Jan for 7 years. They were his found family as opposed to his biological family. And that idea of found family is very important to me personally, and I think is another thing that makes the story very timely for today. Not only, we were also talking about this upstairs, presenting the audience with the question of what would you do? Would you put your life on the line to hide your friends or your boss or people that you know but not very well? And the fact that Miep and Jan continued to hide people throughout the war and just never told anybody in the annex because they would have put them at risk. They had to keep all of that secret. They kept secrets from each other as well as from the Franks. And Anne never wrote about it because Anne didn't know anything about it. So we're very excited to share this story as just a way of deepening our understanding of those people in that time.
Yeah, it's just amazing when you think that the Franks and the other residents of the annex weren't even the only people that Miep was responsible for. But Sharon, I'm interested in getting your perspective on this question as well. When we tell Anne's story today, what is the message that we're looking for, and how has the passage of time influenced the way we look at Anne's story today?
Well, Anne's story is as relevant today as it was when she wrote it. It speaks to humanity. It speaks to spirit. It speaks to insight and inspiration. I'd like to ask the audience, how many people have read the diary? There you go. I need to say no more. If I went on a New York City bus, which I have, and said the same thing, everybody raises their hand, and then I hand out my cards. And we educate to that. And it is very, very relevant. A very interesting story is that in 1958, the House came, Otto, and said, we need money to set up a youth conference center. So they came to the United States, and a foundation was set up, the Anne Frank, American Anne Frank. And the chairman of the board was Eleanor Roosevelt.
Right.
And she wrote the introduction to the first printing of the diary in 1952. On that board was Senator John F. Kennedy, Jacob Javits, Marian Anderson, Robert Wagner, Henry Cabot Lodge. John F. Kennedy used quotes from Anne Frank all the time in his 1960s speeches. I have one, but I won't say it. It's that she is the voice for the 6 million who died. Mm-hmm. And it is totally, totally relevant. When we planted, in 2014, we planted a sapling on the west lawn of the Capitol. Mm-hmm. And I stood there with Harry Reid, Mitch McConnell, Eric Cantor, who said a prayer, and we planted this tree in memory of a young girl who endured the horrors that we will never understand. Harry Reid was so moved by it. And when January 6th happened, I'm looking at this and I know where the tree is. I saw the tree in that picture. It was right to the right. And I knew we were part of that. We were part of that legacy of building humanity and understanding and inspiration. And everyone is touched by Anne Frank in many, many, many different ways. And in 1977, the 5013C that we are now, the Anne Frank Center USA, began educating with Otto's blessing throughout the United States. So we have hit almost every state. We have 2 of our performance actors in the audience, Alex and Olivia, who do 2 live performances, Conversations with Anne and Martin, to talk about the civil rights era. And Anne and Martin Luther King were born the same year, in 1929. And so his letters from Birmingham kind of reflect a little bit about Anne, but not really, but they are. And so we work, and we have been sort of priming the media, because we've given the media everybody from on that bus, from young people, middle-aged people, and older people have read the diary. It's being mandated in many states. There are 12 states that mandate Holocaust education. And never again is never again.
Did you have a comment?
Yeah, well, it's so wonderful to hear all the beautiful ways that this lives on and all the incredible work you're doing. And it's so deeply moving. And at the same time, I'm thinking, because of the work we did on our film, about it's strange to me, I guess I would say, that as a nation we can honor and revere Anne Frank as all the things you're saying and everything she represents, and this voice of hope and resilience and humanity in this, one of the darkest times of human history. And at the same time, painful as it is, our nation did not open our doors to welcome Anne Frank, Otto Frank, and millions of other people who tried to get here for reasons of bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, white nationalism, Christian nationalism, Nazism, whatever words you want to put around it. And we've never really reckoned with that as a nation. And so I hope this is an opportunity in a way, given January 6th and all the things, the conspiracy theories and just the hatred that we see around us, that we can sort of have that conversation.
Well, and also the fact that we're having the conversation again because America has a problem with its own history.
Thank you. That's what I'm trying to say.
And the movement in this country right now to, and I don't think there's a better word for it, whitewash American history is beyond disturbing.
Yeah.
I'm going to open up to audience questions in just a moment. But before I do, I just want to ask one last question to Pieter Kohnstam. Along the same lines, you've written a memoir that covers much of the same, these same years, these same ideas. What would you like readers of your memoir to come away from it thinking about this time period?
I think for us Holocaust survivors, it is extremely important to make sure that we do not forget and remember. But it goes way beyond that. The gentleman was just making some comments as to today. And I believe that at this moment, we are in the crossroads of things that I'm seeing and living. And yes, we are concerned here. We were desecrated 40 years ago in New Jersey. That got me out of the closet. Some of our synagogues here in Minnesota County have been desecrated in the last year. And I think that we have to do what we do at Anne Frank, which is combat ignorance with knowledge, respect, and dignity with and in schools. We've had quite a few Anne Frank presentations here and in other states that I've participated with. And it's always intriguing to me to ask the students and even actors when they're grown up, how do they feel? What do they take out of either playing Anne Frank or Otto Frank or the period? Because it's almost impossible to describe what this girl wrote and many others at a time of brutal murder and persecution. And not just to Jews. 25 million people were massacred. Many of them were from Russia, many of them from Eastern Europe, some evangelicals, the Romanis, not Romans from Rome, but Romanis, the gypsies, and so on. So when I talk and lecture, it is promoting what we do, as Sharon mentioned, our many education programs, because many people do not know what Anne Frank does. Oh yes, I've been in the house, I've seen the annex. Have you seen the rose garden? What rose garden? There's a beautiful rose garden, very small, between the main building in Amsterdam and the annex. A very special rose garden. How do you convey, by knowledge of history, naturally, what has happened? And it's interesting that we are taking Anne as the flag bearer for this kind of quest. And this quest is not finite, because we are in a crux road in America, that if the people of this country are really intent and want to keep the republic, will they really be tenacious and keep it and fight for it? Freedom is very fragile.
I agree.
And it has to be defended, sometimes with blood, through history. And where are we going? And if Anne Frank is going to be it, well, so be it. What better?
Thank you very much. We have a very short time for our audience questions. So I open it up to all of you. There's a microphone coming around. Please wait until you get the microphone. Yeah.
Hi. Once a writer, always a writer. I wrote my question down because I know it would get very emotional. I also want to be what Anne couldn't be. And what my ancestors were denied. I am a writer, and I've been spending the past 3 months unpacking the multi-generational trauma of my grandmother after visiting her in Israel, and before I left, reading the diary for the first time at the age of 24 and visiting the Anne Frank house. And the impacts of surviving this war are so great, and I see it seeping into the present. I see the spike in anti-Semitism. They're here in New York. There's the Goyim police here. They're in Staten Island, showing up at Snug Harbor and at Lincoln Center. They're in the comment section of my Twitter. And I am very aware that everyone on this panel uses a very different tool. And I am so glad that we are armed with all of these, but I wonder what more we can do to move forward when people are refusing to look back or are flat out denying the truth.
Who wants to start?
Tony.
I think you just do your best to use the tools of this generation to reach people. And you find a way to tell the story and to inspire the next generation. I mean, we saw, it was very controversial. We saw the Anne Frank house did this video diary of Anne as a way of reaching the next generation and using tools that they are comfortable with, as opposed to the written word. And I think that look, television has a tremendous reach. TikTok has a tremendous reach. I think you have to employ the tools that are there, that the culture is engaging with.
I think it's also about amplification of all of that. Every time you read something or see something that you find important and moving, share it, like it, pass it on. Keep it going forward. Keep informing. Don't just absorb it and take it in, but spit it back out and share it with as wide an audience as you can, so that these stories stay alive, so that our legacies stay alive, so that we don't have to be afraid. I'm in my entire lifetime, I've never felt anything other than, I mean, I don't even really talk about it. I'm just Jewish. It's not a thing. It's just we are. And now it's become, depending upon where I am, I'm Jewish. And that's not okay. And I was talking to friends of mine, and we were saying that a really dear friend of mine said, I'm actually afraid for the first time in my life to be who I am at my core, And that's not, it shouldn't stand. So we need to tell these stories. We need to keep them moving forward. And we need to take the erasers away if we can. And the only way to do it is to keep talking over them.
Can I say something? Can I add something?
I think I'll just say I agree with everything that's been said. I think there's a large political context that while, what we've seen in working on the history and trying to understand it, the warning signs of authoritarianism that, or not, the key ingredients of authoritarianism that were very much happening in the 30s are around us today. And anti-Semitism is part of it, scapegoating of others and immigrants and people who are not like us, the us and the them. And I guess what I'm trying to say is to expand our scope. Anti-Semitism is very real, racism is very real, white supremacy is very real, and this kind of white Christian nationalist ideology that Nazism and many manifestations of it in different names and ways it gets expressed are very real and part of an authoritarian playbook, which has to do with free and fair elections, peaceful transfer of power, independent media. There's a larger context and a political project, which is what we're talking about. And so sort of calling that out when you see it, I think is also really important and gives us, I think, a common cause.
And I would also say that the thing that I've discovered working on our show is that those people at the time considered that they lived in the modern world.
Right.
They lived in the modern world. They were modern people living in the 20th century, and it was inconceivable to them that such a thing could happen. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I've certainly had the conversation in the past 6 months about where do we go.
Right.
I don't know anybody who's not having that conversation.
Yep. I'd like to address this young lady. Anne said that human greatness does not lie in, wealth and power, but in goodness and character and goodness. And you can be an Anne Frank ambassador for all of that, and just be your authentic self. And may she continue to be an inspiration to all who seek hope and freedom. And as Anne has said, human greatness does not lie in wealth and power, but in character and goodness. So we all have to look for that. And you can find it in your acting, in your writing. The diary has inspired millions of people to write diaries of their own, and you should do the same, because it's unique to you and will heal you. Okay, Pieter. Thank you.
We are at maybe I'm a little bit different from all of you, except maybe Sharon, because this is my third nationality in my 86 years. And I've lived under 3 dictatorships: Nazism, fascism, and Peronism, including a little Francoism. We are here today educating and enlightening our children and grandchildren for them to know and the generations to come to know. The problem that we have, which is unfortunately infiltrated and poisoned much of many people in this country, half of the country, maybe a little less, who claim not to know that the Holocaust existed. And I am being asked daily through my lectures or not, Holocaust, what was that? So it proves the point that we at Anne Frank have to be tenacious and continue the infinite or unending education, which is non-discriminatory for all. What we're seeing in America 80 years later is interesting, coming back to what we had already seen and lived 80 years or 90 years ago. And the choice is for the people here to do it. Where are we going? If we are not going to stand up and speak out that certain acts are against the law and are not permissible under the Constitution, defending the freedom of speech, then we will have some severe problems. There's also a complete not knowledge of words that are being used, not much by the media, that some people do not know what they really mean. And some people who believe in government that the Holocaust didn't exist know it existed.
Of course they do.
And that's a problem. So we have factions now that you all know. And the question that was asked a few minutes ago is, what do we do and where are we going? Much of this future education will come through the Anne Franks. Jewish organizations are doing their work in some areas or not, some more political oriented than education-wise. There's been some meetings on the Capitol Hill recently. Doug Emhoff was running a very interesting meeting a few days ago. But then naturally former President Trump ran a few meetings in Mar-a-Lago that are inexcusable. But in a country of law and freedom of speech, until there is not something to impose some regulations and rules, like let's say in Germany, where they recently, a few days ago, have imprisoned and detained 20 people, including one prince from the former German government before World War I. Yeah. It's amazing. To the lady who became emotional, it is standing up to your rights, knowing history, and voting. The media is extremely important, and what Paley is doing is fantastic.
Thank you, Pieter.
Thank you. Well, with that, I'm afraid we have to wrap it up for tonight. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here.
Our pleasure.
Thank you again to all of you.
Thank you.